I'm Angie Hacker here with Prosper Sustainably, and today I'm talking with Dr. Douglas Walker. Dr. Walker is a licensed psychologist and Chief Programs Director at Mercy Family Center, located in Louisiana. At Mercy, Dr. Walker leads community-based programs for local and tribal communities and has specific expertise in psychosocial disaster recovery, which is why I recruited him as an advisor for a climate change and health program that Prosper is working on. And today we are going to talk about how psychological recovery and social capital efforts can help communities effectively prepare for and respond to climate-driven disasters. So Dr. Walker is going to share his lessons learned and some practical tips for communities doing this work on the ground. So thank you, Dr. Walker. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Angie. Glad to be here.
So you're actually dealing with a little bit of a climate event yourself today, right?
Yeah, typical Louisiana weather trailing off the Gulf of Mexico. We have a lot of moisture down here. So every once in a while we get these trailing storms that can flood New Orleans pretty easily since we're mostly below sea level. But we're surviving this one, and actually has survived pretty well this year, hurricane season itself, although we feel bad for other areas of the Gulf Coast being hit. That's the way we navigate down here, from June 1st to November 1st.
Yeah, you actually said you were on tornado alert today, right?
Yeah, we were, yes.
So we especially thank you for your time today. I know it's a hectic day. So just to give our audience a little bit more context, you and I had a recent conversation on how to address mental health impacts on various climate change exposures as part of the Tribal Climate Health Project. And I felt your perspective would be really valuable to share with the communities that we work with that are trying to sort through a variety of different risks and options for addressing climate change in their community. So I thought we could first start off by helping folks understand how your work at Mercy intersects with climate change.
Sure, absolutely. So my history with large responses to natural events came by way of Hurricane Katrina. So back in the day, as I say, I was minding my own business, clinical psychologist working at a nonprofit mental health Mercy down in New Orleans. And after Katrina, I was invited to create a response, a trauma response for children in area schools. And so with that effort, I began to not only learn, but to teach others how to handle long-term disaster recovery. I have to say that I was kind of naive to the whole thing prior. I mean, I had done some work in trauma, working with pediatrics in hospitals, and I've done some other types of work in my kind of individual clients, but never appreciating long-term recovery on a mass scale until Katrina happened. And so through that, we were able to gain in New Orleans called best practices, addressing trauma, particularly in schools, but also along the way appreciating what more we could do earlier on that doesn't meet or address, say, the PTSD or the more traditional concepts of trauma. What can we do before someone is having serious issues with anxiety, depression, PTSD-like symptoms? What can we do early on? What kind of preventative, maybe even community-based programs can we create or implement to help address these large-scale, say, subclinical issues?
Right, and you must have felt in your experience with Hurricane Katrina there was some gaps that you could help fill.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we were blessed, in being trained with a handful of evidence-based practices, and later some what we call evidence-informed. So maybe not so clinically vetted, but also certainly research-based. And now these programs are backed by the federal government. And so we're using them. We're using them after identified federal disasters, training crisis counseling programs, and these evidence-informed practices, as we say. But that's kind of the nuts and bolts, the bricks, I guess, that we use in thinking about disaster response. But I think more and more we're understanding the value of community. I certainly got my my lessons quickly in large-scale response for psychological, what we call psychosocial response after Katrina. But it wasn't until the BP oil spill, our Deepwater Horizon oil spill, that I really had the opportunity to look more at what the community or community-based resiliency programming could be. Again, getting, as we say, upstream as far as we could in creating resiliency in communities. And that's where my first large cooperative programs came with the United Home Nation down here in Louisiana. And knowing that that disaster was not only an environmental one, but as an economic one as well, especially for that community. And so we were humble walking in, talking with their council. We were very humble about what we were able to offer around resiliency, knowing that that community had been around, documented for over 300 years. So I took the time to contemplate what we had to offer, and realized very quickly that it was really a reminder around resiliency, that our programs now that we've created, what we call evidence informed, really are reinforcing what a lot of tribal communities already know, and that's held them together over, over thousands of years, really.
Right, that's right. Well, you're really a leader then in this evolving research area, and not just research, but implementation. So you're not only designing community-based programs, but you're helping to implement them on the ground in Louisiana, and that is obviously replicable in other places. Maybe you can share with us, we want to define some terms, but can you share with us on a personal level why psychosocial recovery is such an essential area for communities to focus on, and are they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have to step back again from this idea that everyone is going to need some type of formal mental health intervention. In my experience, 80% of individuals, if given the right resources, support, will do pretty well. Of course, there's some variables, and depending on what type of disaster, every disaster has its own what we call signature. How closely someone is to that by way of, say, person or place, relationship. But for me, what really distills down to, and I think is most important that people remember, is a sense of community. Now, it may sound simple, but I think over the past couple decades, have really created this individualistic type of society where it's not only me, but individual choice. And sometimes that individual choice is around stepping out alone when impacted like something like this, man-made or natural disasters. So someone said, Doug, what's the one thing we should focus on? What should we double down or put all our poker chips into? And that would be connectedness. There's a researcher by the name of Daniel Aldrich out of Purdue University. He's done some fantastic work around looking at what we call social capital. And he is really quantifying what we've already known for a long time, that the tighter that communities are prior to a disaster, the closer they are after, and in turn can recover a lot quicker. And so a lot of the programming that we see around disaster response, one of which is what we call psychological first aid. There's a couple of versions of it, but the one that I embrace is the one authored by both the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the National Center for PTSD. The other, which is a more long-term resiliency-based program, it's called Skills for Psychological Recovery. That's by the same authors. Both embrace this idea of connections or connectivity. But I think it's also the tip of the iceberg as well. I think it can be much more. I think people forget that that we have neighbors and neighbors that we can lean on, not just for a cup of sugar, or if after a natural disaster, a chainsaw, or a gallon of gas. But I think it's that connectivity in the future that'll make the difference. I believe, maybe in 5 or 10 years, that we will arrive at a place where we're building capacity in a very, very predictable way. So in the U.S., we have something called Night Out Against Crime. And so communities will plan that event. They'll get to know each other and talk about planning around violence in their community. I would hope that in the future that we could gather as communities before, say, hurricane season, or even once or twice a year, to get to know your neighbors. So when when things like this do happen, some many unpredictable. So things like tornadoes today, earthquakes, wildfires are so quick. Um, Knowing your neighbor would be extremely important. So I think that's the future, and I've had the opportunity to, as you'd say, double down on that concept, and have created a program born of a disaster, helped create a program born of a disaster out of Joplin, Missouri. Um, that program is called How's Your Five? And if you'd allow me to tell a story, I'll tell you a story.
I would love a story, and I actually want to make sure that our listeners can keep up with some of the language we're using. So
Absolutely.
maybe before I want to dive really deep to make this real for the folks that are listening and how to do this,
Yep.
on the ground, what it looks like. But can you help us define? Let's start with psychosocial recovery. That's a word I think is new to folks, even those that are focused on climate change. Maybe they're focused on health, then maybe they get focused on mental health, but it might be a bit more clinical. So the psychosocial word, I think, is new to a lot of folks. Help us.
Yeah, so I would give the Canadians credit for the word or the terminology psychosocial, having done a lot of work in Alberta after their floods near Calgary, and then for the Fort McMurray fires. Psychosocial has helped me define everything that's not all clinical, all tied up in disease, the disease model of mental health or even mental illnesses, everything below. It's really that connectivity. I guess it's born of how we relate to each other, but it can be something simple as teaching coping strategies, teaching people how to problem solve, teaching people how to manage their emotions, reminding people how to reach out and connect with each other. In some way, I wouldn't say it's not so much self-help, but it is everything that you can do for yourself in maintaining, say, a mental wellness. And so psychosocial is not only individual focused, but it's community as well. So I try, again, to focus on psychosocial because I think if we do our job at that level, we can do much, we can rely on the more expensive and higher levels of care that we would consider like individual treatment from a psychologist like myself or a psychiatrist. The WHO, the World Health Organization, has a nice pyramid that looks at different levels of care for mental health and wellness. And the first is self-care, not eat right, don't drink too much, exercise, mindfulness. The second level, which I don't think has really been tapped into yet, is what we call community care. And that's what I'm talking about here. Psychosocial is not only individual responsibility of taking care of your mental wellness, but also the community's need to take care of each other as well.
Yeah, so I've been reading some of the materials that you sent to me, which are great, and we're going to link them down below for folks so they have access to the resources that we mentioned. One of them kind of makes a distinction between the medical society focusing more on the avoidance of pathology versus the goal of psychosocial recovery, which it describes more as the goal being about post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
Can you help us understand that piece a little bit more about the goal of psychosocial recovery?
Yeah, I mean the goal there is to be independent, to not have a pathological model where everyone is going to need some type of higher level of care. This concept of post-traumatic growth we're still learning about, and I'm not sure, having gone through a large-scale disaster myself, whether or not post-traumatic growth can be grown. I think people have to pass through and to pass out, kind of come out the other side to demonstrate some type of post-traumatic growth and to be stronger than they were before. So we're still, I know that individuals still trying to understand it and whether it can be somehow reinforced. But I do believe, having been a survivor myself, in this case Katrina, that people do have individual trauma narratives. We create stories that help us understand what happened to us, but also share that oral history with others. And I think that helps us as individuals and communities heal. And so that's a theme that you'll see in trauma recovery, either as a community or individual, that there's stories to be told. And when that story evolves over time and is witnessed by other people, I think people have the opportunity then and only then to achieve this idea of post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm. In their framing of what happened to them.
Yep, to reframe, or what they call making sense, meaning making.
Yep.
Of what of how they've been transformed by the experience.
So speaking of stories, you were going to share a personal story with us, and I interrupted you. So yeah, please share with us. We'd love to make this as real for people as possible.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't invite myself to disasters. I know and acknowledge the fact that communities have their own experts, and I was in this case invited to join in the recovery in Joplin, Missouri, after the EF5 tornado. I was invited because the hospital that was struck there was a Mercy hospital, my company's hospital. And in focus groups there, they were struggling, as many people do, with where the community was. And this was maybe 4 months after the tornado. And in focus groups, they highlighted employment as a concern. So now working too much or too little, or having to travel long distances now that the tornado had passed through the center of town and destroyed a lot of the industry. Second, they were worried about relationships, and so certainly lives lost or injured. So in that tornado, I think 163 people died, or strained by way of having to live with others now, to move and be strained in the small confines of a new home with new relationships. People were not taking care of themselves as regards to what we call positive activities or joyful activities. So not playing bingo as much or at all, or seeing friends down at the VFW. Sleep is a real problem, especially that summer for storms were continuing to roll through Missouri. And so the fear, the constant vigilance and wondering if another tornado would come through was clear and present. And finally, we call consumption. So people were having trouble maintaining healthy eating habits, but also drug and alcohol. So this idea of consumption. And so in this focus group, we also acknowledged, like many communities, everyone's kind of has the attitude that other people need it more than them. That kind of Midwest pull yourself up by the bootstraps. So when people were asked how they were doing, they would just say, I'm fine. Someone else needs more help than I do. But yet we had against that, I guess the other flip side of that coin was everyone was talking about these 5 things: work, relationships, play, sleep, and then this idea with consumption, or challenge with consumption. And they said, Doug, what do we do with this? We know that these 5 things are important, but no one's talking about them. And someone in the group said, well, why don't we just ask them how's their 5, or how's your 5? And at that moment, we coined what's now grown to be a psychosocial program for communities that are looking at ways to bind them together by way of these 5 domains. So it's work, love, play, sleeping, and the last one we say eating, but it's all types of consumption. So it's called How's Your 5, and we've been able to grow it over the past 5 or 6 years. We've used it down here with the homeless. We've got some great pictures of we did a powwow. We co-sponsored a powwow with them, I think about 1.5 years ago, and so now it's part of their wellness program. We launched it certainly in Joplin. We've introduced it up in around Fort McMurray and other parts of the U.S. After disasters, but other people have embraced it as just a good community building, resiliency building opportunity. And so we've had a lot of traction with that. And that kind of taps into that, I think, unexplored area of community resilience, or how do you build a sense of community? In this way, by having a conversation.
Do you think there's differences for tribal communities versus non-tribal communities in terms of how this works?
Yeah, we did focus groups with the homeless prior to launch. We had to adjust some of the verbiage that would apply more to their relationships or their sense of work, their sense of what's needed in their community. So I think there's always tweaking to be done in any community. But again, when I stood before their council and introduced the idea of How's Your Five, I realized very humbly that they knew all these things. It just had to be reinforced in ways that maybe they never thought about before. But if anything, I think tribal communities have a leg up on others in that there's an intimacy there that can really be used as an advantage. And so,
right.
and passing it through leadership, council, and elders, I think programs like How's Your Five have the opportunity to bring a prompting to the conversation. So, Angie, if I was to ask you how you doing today, you might say just fine.
Right.
But if I asked you how's your five, you may think for a moment. There'll be a moment where you'll think, and then you may tell me how you slept the last couple nights or what you did for fun this weekend. So I think it allows people a safe way to enter a conversation about caring for each other without just blowing off the question.
Right.
And I think there's a social contract for people that use it. If I asked you that same question, you want to know that I'm being genuine in asking it too. I'm just not doing it as being polite,
Right. Yeah. The word that came up for me was authenticity, and how we build that into our social interactions where they're habitually maybe not always there.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to continue to dive even more deeply, and I'll just use an example. I'm actually going to be writing a grant for a tribe that has gone through the vulnerability assessment process for climate change, and they've come up with some adaptation strategies, and now they actually want to start working on this stuff. They pointed out some of the community building and psychosocial resilience areas as something they'd like to focus on some of their early implementation. Mm-hmm. And so it's really real for me to look at what real interventions can we look to that communities can build and start designing that are working. What are some of the early research findings telling us? And let's talk really practically what those look like. And so you gave us a good example. Maybe you can share with us some of the other strategies.
Yeah. So I think the most successful kind of community-wide interventions that we've done that fall within kind of the psychosocial combine two areas. So one is format, and I'll speak to that in a moment. So how the messages are delivered, and second is practice. So we have used this Skills for Psychological Recovery. The acronym is SPR. You can find it online very easily. It's free. This resiliency program. We've used it after disasters in two formats that provide capacity. So this is an issue as well. It's how many people can we help in the shortest amount of time. The most successful, I think, and the most natural that we've used is at community dinners. So in Joplin and up in Fort McMurray in particular, and now I think most recently in Sonoma after their wildfires, they're beginning, at least in Sonoma, following suit. What Joplin has done or did, and what Fort Mac did, was to take grant money, apply it to a series of community dinners where the topic that night would be sleep hygiene. Okay, so we know that after disasters or challenges there, that sleep could be worry around what will happen, anxiety. So we do a short clip on sleep and sleep hygiene, and then offer up the opportunity for people, say at dessert time, to speak with someone more about it. We have applied that Skills for Psychological Recovery, so in a formal way, where over, say, 5 weeks, we talk about problem solving, we talk about managing emotions, we talk about positive activity scheduling, We talk about certainly social connections, and then finally this idea of helpful thinking. Not so much positive thinking, but can we change our outlook to make sure that we don't never get stuck. One thing, Angie, that we haven't talked about, and one of the things that I have learned, that long-term recovery is very difficult. Most communities are blessed when disasters happen by a way of kind of short-term attention. So over 1 year's time, the media, the money, everyone rushes in to help, and that's kind of in some ways a honeymoon period. The communities that you're describing, especially when we look at long-term changes in regards to climate, are going to be subtle and long. So for communities like Joplin or Fort McMurray, or now in California or anywhere on the Gulf Coast, it's that the day after the 1 year anniversary, that 366th day, where people go away. The money goes away, the help goes away, the attention, and they don't come back for another 5 years. And it's programs like this, these community dinners, reinforced by evidence-informed practices like skills for psychological recovery, that seem to work really well. So the bottom line, and again, every community is different, is to reinforce the idea of always coming together, teaching some basic skills, and offering people the opportunity to talk about it more, and even more intensely if they need, say, more help for themselves or their family.
So there's a term, psychoeducation, right?
Yep.
That's a form of community outreach and education. Does that have to be done by a trained professional, or can folks in their community learn how to do it and start these initiatives themselves?
Yeah. Thankfully, and I'm so glad to say this, is that no, you don't need a license. You don't have to be a mental health professional to provide psychosocial. Our strongest programs, the programs that we helped roll out in Joplin and Fort McMurray, were done with paraprofessionals. These were non-licensed mental health professionals, because we want persons, if that makes sense. We want people who are good with others, have caring, and most important, empathy. And some of the best models harness that caring aspects of individuals. I remember having trained in Tennessee after some flooding, and we had done some training after that disaster, and we designed a program that aligned a mental health person, so like a master's level, with a regular, just a really good people person. So some of our best teams, we found out later, was like a social worker and an underemployed plumber.
Wow.
Yeah. So and I use that example because think about what plumbers have to do each day. They have to problem solve. So they have to get from point A to B, right?
Yes.
So that
in front of their client.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So if they're going door to door, they have the ability to think in those terms of how to practically solve problems, and that's sometimes the nudge or the assistance that people need after long-term recovery is to problem solve. So that problem solving can look like, how do I find the right contractor? How do I work through the paperwork involved with applying for recovery monies? So in the end, we want to train and give over these type of psychosocial programs to communities. So Joplin is doing well. They're on their own. Fort Mac, I've trained. They're growing great on their own. I always want to, as a consultant, build capacity and ownership, and I always acknowledge that the real knowledge, the expertise, lies in the community.
That's right. Especially when you're dealing with grant funds, where you're going to get an influx and then it stops someday.
Yep. Yeah. So you've got to build that capacity early, and I know what I know, but I don't know, what the community knows. So combining this idea of best practices and culture and community knowledge is always the best model.
So would you recommend that a committee forms around this? Who, I guess, leads and sustains these efforts? typically?
The structure can be, different for each community, but I think a team effort, what we call multidisciplinary. So people who are, yes, decision makers, but are representative of the community.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be, it could be schools, it could be houses of worship, certainly elders. Certainly parents, even teenagers. So who have some sense of where they want their community to be. I think we forget that in a short time, those say teenagers are going to be adults and are going to adopt anything that you create. So if you're talking long-term recovery, resilience, 5-10 years, you better invest in your children, certainly your teenagers, as having some buy-in and feeling as though they have some power over these decisions.
Yeah.
So the upside of that as well is that they're likely, if given this type of say control, but certainly participation, they'll stay around in the community and won't go off and never come back.
Right. So as people are partner building and building consortiums, not forget to include the youth. That could be really powerful. Yeah. Can we talk a little bit too? I know that I've seen different strategies from things like call centers being really helpful. For maybe that's the psychological first aid you mentioned.
Right.
Having different mapping processes, where the social services are, where the vulnerable populations are, where there are connections perhaps between those two, and then things like notifications and communications. Are those all wrapped in? What other elements are there to psychosocial resilience?
Yeah, I think access is always important, and what you described would be different for each community, what works best. So for some, it could be radio. I know the homeless rely a lot on their radio station. I wouldn't ever reinvent the wheel. I would never introduce a way of communicating or gathering information that would be new to a community. So coming in with something fancy that you think from the outside would work really well may not work at all. So that's where asking the community, how do you communicate now? Where's your central sources of information? How do you trade information now? Because that's going to, if you double down or invest in those types of lines of communication, then you're likely to do pretty well. Finding those community champions, and so those are the unsung heroes that know everybody. I always think or believe still, and I think some communities have done work in this. If you want to train folks in psychosocial or be able to trade information about, one, how the community's doing or where to get help, train the barbers, train the hairdressers, right? Think about train the, so
informal therapy.
Yeah. So exactly. So train those folks. The hardware stores where people spend time talking about how they're doing.
Yeah.
And so I've always dreamed about coming in after a disaster and being able to really take a good look at those types of under the radar mental health providers that we don't traditionally see as providers, but they are. Again, the people that we sit and talk with in a very real way. And like I said, I have a barbershop right across the street from here that I go, and there's a little bit of gossip and catching up, but also there's the genuine kind of how you're doing and what's going on in your life kind of thing.
Yeah, sort of where's the trusted listeners, right?
Yeah. And so I am always excited in working with the community to find these little, not so little gems of opportunity to share. In New York City, for instance, after Superstorm Sandy, I learned it was the libraries there that were the places that people gathered and that could disseminate information. That was their center. And so we did groups there. We provided information out of there. In Fort McMurray, it was more the schools. They have a large recreation center there, and so they were able to.
And that was after a fire, correct?
After the wildfires, yeah. So every community is going to be the same, and you have to be comfortable with building your own product because it's homegrown. There has to be some worry there, of course, in wanting to get it right. But if you work from the inside out, if you rely on what you already know and build upon it, I would think that most communities do really, really well, because you'll be inundated with a lot of help. So unfortunately, there are communities, there are entities, organizations that will come in from the outside to help, but oftentimes they're not there forever. So to rely on them would be maybe not the best in really designing something long term for communities.
You know, you brought that up in the recent advisory call that we had, some cautions that you were really interested in sharing with communities about their collaborative efforts. And so as we talk about the literature behind community building, a lot of it is about partnering with the right organizations, leveraging and working together, but there are some things to look out for, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah.
Some guidance there?
Yeah. So I think the most important question is if you're approached by someone from outside your community, is ask it respectfully, what's in it for you? Because there are organizations out there, no matter how reputable, who are looking for different things. And so I'm not pointing fingers, but sometimes, for instance, universities, although they may have a very strong credibility and namesake, they themselves coming in may be looking for research opportunities, which drive positions in the university, which the whole publishing piece. Mm-hmm. You may be approached by an organization who wants to show you or implement a certain intervention per se, and so what they may be doing is trying to get some credibility around this intervention, or even for themselves. So some hard questions to ask is, what's in it for you? How long will you be around? What's in it for us in this? Where will you be in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? What's the expectation? So if you have an entry, what's your exit strategy? What things will be permanent for us? How will you build capacity so we can continue doing the work that you do? So these are important questions to ask. You would like to think that everyone's altruistic after disasters, but sadly, there are individuals out there who are out for their own reputation to increase or build upon. It's sad, but I've seen it time and time again.
So you ask good questions, and those are great. Is there any other kind of vetting you might recommend? Reference checks, doing it.
Well, I would. Yeah, well, even reference. I would ask who they've worked with before as a community and contact them.
Yeah.
So let's say XYZ University approaches you and says, we want to provide mental health for a year and a half, 2 years, and we're gonna put these mental health people in your community, and these are all the benefits. This is what you'll get out of it. This is what we'll get out of it. So you'd want to ask XYZ University who they've worked with before, mm-hmm. and talk to those people how it went.
Right.
That it was truly a collaborative partnership, because this word collaborative I think is overused. I think it can be pretty rare to have a win-win for everyone. And so it has to be designed respectfully, because in the end, that XY University is probably not going to be there. So what do they leave? What legacy do they leave as far as something permanent that the community can be proud of and take ownership of?
You sound like you speak from experience.
A little bit. I've had to stand up for myself and the programs that I've helped develop. I've had to vet. I've been vetted. And I would say that I am not always the right person for the job. I don't invite myself to disasters. I don't chase And when I am invited in, I know it's in a lot of ways sacred space because I'm walking into someone else's home.
That's right.
And I don't make any assumptions. I try. I do. I create this hopefully this conversation of humility because I know what I know, what I've gone through. Certainly, what I say can resonate with folks, but again, I'm not the expert in their community. So, and you want to look for people like that that are well enough established that they admit that they don't know it all.
Yeah, yep. I really appreciate that perspective, and I think it does definitely build trust with communities when you're working with them. Okay, so my last question for you is after 10 years, say look down the line 10 years from now, what do you hope communities across the country have done to better prepare themselves for their own specific and unique climate change risks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in 10 years' time, the best thing that communities can do for themselves is to know your neighbor by first name, and being able to walk over 3 or 4 doors down and have a conversation outside of disaster. So before you're preparing for a hurricane coming in or wildfire season, that's my true hope, is that we can rely less on traditional mental health by improving the connectivity that we have with each other by way of neighbors. Mm-hmm. We have to. Here's a prop. So we got to put down these cell phones, right? We've got to get off our couches. We've got to get on our front porch. We've got to walk our streets, and we've got to be able to shake hands with new people on the block. And I think that is the true future. If we want to have a step up against climate change with regards to psychosocial, we have to know each other. We have to be able to shake hands, be comfortable in asking for help or giving help to the neighbors around us. And that's not just people down the street, but above us. You know, multi-level living is a challenge. And so when you get into larger cities, knowing who your neighbor isn't as easy as walking next door. So we've got to come up with some strategies for multi-level living, the complexities of the housing that we now reside in our more dense areas of the U.S. So yeah, the short answer is just again, knowing who your neighbor is.
And what I found really inspiring and empowering about all of this is it seems doable, but not necessarily easy. And so it does take a community to decide to intervene in some way, right? To figure out how to build community in their community. And just, the final thought, do you have a sense for what keeps communities from doing that? Is it just awareness about how important it is?
Well, I think there's always a target or something looming. So the challenge around climate change is that it's a creeping disaster. It's happening slowly. If I have a storm in the Gulf of Mexico whose track is going to be hitting somewhere around New Orleans, I'm probably going to start walking the streets, checking in on neighbors. So what's your plan? What are you going to do? Are you going to stay or are you going to go? I'm sure other communities, say around wildfires, do the same that season, checking in on people, word on the street. Challenge with climate change and the adversities that come with it is that it's creeping slowly. So there's no kindling, there's no event on the horizon that's so soon to urge us to go out and do that. And I used before Night Out Against Crime as a model. I don't know offhand how we can best promote this. Again, I think tribal communities have a leg up because of their natural propensity to be together and be connected. For those of us that live in larger and less homogeneous communities, we're going to have to find a way to do that and to be able to measure that kind of change. So this idea of social capital is still to be discovered. How do we measure that stickiness, that connectivity that we have with each other? it's going to be hard. It's, and like I think you put it out, Angie. It's a very easy thing to say, but how do you do it, right? How do you reinforce it? So it's going to be a challenge. Thankfully, that we're wired as human beings to be gregarious, so we've got that going for us. I think overall we like to hang out with each other. So if we can reinforce that more in the face of climate change, I think we'll be doing all right.
Well, I'm going to take that as a huge opportunity for communities to be piloting innovative ways to do all this and sharing it amongst each
Absolutely.
other. And I am excited to see how communities do that, because I'm learning more and more and more in my own research that this is an area where we can get a lot of bang for our time and buck in terms of our ability to cope with climate change. So I want to say thank you so much, Dr. Walker, for your time, and I'm sure our listeners have gotten a lot out of this session. And so I wanted to thank our listeners as well for spending some time with us.
For more information like this, we hope you'll subscribe to Prosper Sustainably's e-news, like us on Facebook and LinkedIn, and we're excited to help your community prosper sustainably. Until next time.